Huh?
It's 5:02 and welcome in to a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. According to ad tracking firm and ad agency Ad Impact, the Harris-Walz presidential campaign has made major changes to much of its remaining ad spends in North Carolina as we sit here just 6 days ahead of Election Day, pulling apparently millions of dollars worth of ads from the state in major media markets. This comes as Kamala Harris will be in the state today. Former President Trump will also be in Rocky Mount. Her campaign event is scheduled in Raleigh, but that's not the only media market where she is pulling ads. Apparently, it is across the state, over $2 million worth of ads being pulled by the Harris team. In the latest Carolina Journal statewide poll, Harris and Trump are tied at 47 apiece, and many other polls show similar numbers to that as well. However, Trump leads Harris from Charlotte to Western North Carolina by 12 points and leads Harris by 9 points in Eastern North Carolina. They are tied in Central North Carolina at 45 apiece, and the only demographic area where Harris is ahead of Trump is the Triangle area, which consists of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, where she leads the former president 55% to 40%. Reports online indicate that some of that money is being moved to other states to shore up the vote in Virginia, which recent polling has shown that's a much closer race, and trying to solidify victories in other states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada. Keeping our attention on the presidential race this morning, President Joe Biden last night made a very interesting comment about supporters of President Trump on CNN. Take a listen.
Or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization is seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American.
Well, similar to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables in 2016, the president and Joe Biden, who is not running for re-election, calls Trump and his supporters garbage during a Harris campaign call. We have seen reaction. This happened late last night. Reaction overnight from Democrat individuals not happy with the comments made by the president in Joe Biden. The governor of Pennsylvania, very much a swing state, said last night, quote, "I'm giving you my fresh reaction to it. I would never insult the good people of Pennsylvania or any American, even if they choose to support a candidate that I didn't support." You are likely going to hear a lot about that throughout the day today. We will be keeping an eye on both of the presidential candidates that will be in the state. Again, Harris in Raleigh, the former president, and Trump over in the Rocky Mount area for rallies today. North Carolina continues to be one of the closest swing states, according to Real Clear Politics this morning. Trump has a 1-point advantage in the state. There were 4 polls out yesterday, most of those showing a tie or a 1+ for each candidate in that race. We'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Some other news this morning: despite the challenges that residents have faced after Hurricane Helene, voter turnout in the 13 western North Carolina counties that were the hardest hit have slightly exceeded the rest of the state at this point in the early voting cycle. That's some good news to pass along. Data shows that 39.97% of registered voters in those 13 counties have already cast a vote, compared to 39.92% in the rest of the state. However, the counties fall behind the rest of the state with in-person voting by about 3%, making voting by mail their primary choice, which makes sense when you look at some of the logistical challenges out in western North Carolina. They have approximately 5% more mail-in ballots sent out than the rest of the state, and all election boards in those 13 affected counties are operating, which means if people can and want to vote, they can do so as they always have. And when early voting began back on October the 17th, election officials in those affected counties were operating at 76 early voting locations, only 4 fewer than initially planned. Recent temporary changes to election law and regulations by the North Carolina General Assembly and the North Carolina State Board of Elections have helped in trying to make this as seamless, and I say that, of course, in the context of the devastation, but as seamless as possible in that area. Measures include letting affected counties alter early voting times and places, as well as Election Day precinct locations where they can accept election workers and observers from outside the county. That's something that's not normally allowed. Displaced voters can submit their mail-in ballots in person to any early voting or county board of election office across the state of North Carolina. In addition to those changes, the General Assembly provided an additional $5 million to the State Board of Elections to assist those election boards in those affected areas. That assistance included an emergency generator that the NCSBE provided to the Hot Springs early voting site in Yancey County back on the 17th before power was fully restored, and it still continues to be restored to that area. It's now 5:08 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got some breaking news this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour in regards to a state, then federal, now a state again lawsuit. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us with details. Mitch, a major legal challenge over some 225,000 voters had a ruling yesterday. What are the details that you're tracking this morning?
Well, the important part about this, Nick, is the fact that we're talking about 225,000 people who were registered to vote in North Carolina without a proper form, according to a lawsuit from state and national Republican groups. Because the form didn't ask the people registering to vote for a driver's license number or the last four digits of a social security number, it didn't comply with a federal law called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. That's why Republicans went to court in state court asking for a state judge to say that either those 225,000 people had to be removed from the voter rolls, or more likely that they would have to cast a provisional ballot, and then election officials would have to go back and ensure that those folks were actually eligible to register and to vote. Now, in some recent court hearings, the Republicans have said they don't expect that 225,000 people registered who weren't really eligible, but they said some subset of those people are. Is it 2,000? Is it 25,000? No one really knows, but the State Board of Elections has the information to make that decision. Now, here was the big development. This case was filed in state court, and Republicans who filed the suit argued that these are state court issues. The State Board of Elections had the case moved from state court to federal court. They wanted federal courts to decide this. This went before the chief district judge in the Eastern District, Richard Myers, who held a hearing in October in Wilmington to deal with this issue. The day that he held the hearing, he decided to do two different things. First, one part of the lawsuit he dismissed. He said the Republicans did not have the standing to bring this suit, and so they can't file it. No one could deal with it. The other part of the suit, though, was a state constitutional claim. And what Judge Myers said was, as a federal judge, I shouldn't deal with this. This is something that should be dealt with in the state courts. So he wanted to have the case sent back to state courts. Well, the State Board of Elections, who had moved the case to federal court, and the Democratic National Committee, which had intervened in this case, both said, no, this should stay in federal court. They appealed to the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. A three-judge panel of the Fourth Circuit, all appointed by Democrats, held oral arguments, more than an hour of them this week. And then within a day of those oral arguments, the decision came down saying the case is going to stay in federal court. They said this is something for the federal courts to handle, because what the Republicans are arguing is that the State Board of Elections violated our state constitution because they didn't comply with federal law. And the Democrats and the State Board of Elections say, well, the only way you could prove this is to violate the federal law. That makes it a federal case. It needs to stay in the federal courts. And so the upshot is the case goes back to Judge Myers. He is now going to have to deal with the second piece, whether the State Board of Elections violated the state constitution by not complying with HAVA. And it's very likely that once Judge Myers issues a ruling, there could be another appeal back to the Fourth Circuit to deal with that. But in the meantime, all of those 225,000 voters remain on the rolls, and because there's been no ruling saying that they have to cast a provisional ballot. They're casting a ballot just like everyone else. I think Republicans, in some respects, are trying to raise at least the specter that some of those folks, not a majority, maybe not even a large minority, but at least some of them are likely people who were not eligible. And because the State Board of Elections didn't ask for that information, driver's license number or last four digits of the Social Security number, that a few or more, maybe some thousands of votes might go through from people who weren't really eligible to vote.
Mitch, it would be disingenuous of me not to look at the calendar this morning and see that we are just 6 days away from Election Day. More than 3 million people have already voted during the early voting period here in North Carolina. Is this a legal situation that is likely to be handled and dealt with after the November election is said and done? Is there enough runway for anything to even happen here at this point?
I suspect it would be very hard for a ruling to come out that would actually change something that happens with voting between now and Election Day. When the Court of Appeals heard the oral arguments, Chief Judge Albert Diaz said at the end of the hearing, the clock is ticking, we'll get a ruling to you soon. And the Fourth Circuit ruled within a day, basically. And so it'll go back to Judge Myers. I suspect that he'll try to come up with a ruling fairly soon. But if he allows the case to continue, it's almost certain that he wouldn't do anything that would affect the balloting that's going on now, not only because we're so close to Election Day, but also because so many, as you mentioned, millions of voters have already cast ballots. If you force some people to cast provisional ballots now and not others, you're going to be having two different standards. And that would probably lend itself to a new lawsuit saying that you're treating people unequally and they're not having the equal protection of the laws. So my guess is the final resolution of this takes place sometime after the election.
We've got some additional lawfare regarding the North Carolina State Board of Elections. We'll continue that conversation with Mitch Kokai coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look this morning at traffic with our friend Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And look,
It's 5:19. Welcome back to a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Well, if you've got nothing going on tonight, well, you should. You can join us for WBT's Talktoberfest News and Brews. It's taking place tonight at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts from 7 to 9 p.m. The entire WBT Air team will be there. There are just a few tickets available as of this morning. If you don't already have your tickets, join us tonight. WBT's Talktoberfest News and Brews. You can get your tickets now by visiting WBT.com and clicking on the Talktoberfest News and Brews banner. It's now 5:20 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, continuing to track some statewide news this morning. In the 2024 election, over 211,000 voters between the ages of 18 and 24 have cast ballots thus far, though youth turnout has fallen compared to the same period in 2020. And while young voters typically tend to lean more liberal, turnout is down by about 45,000 individuals from 4 years ago, a factor concerning for Democrats who often rely on this younger demographic of voters to vote. In comparison, young Republicans have slightly exceeded their 2020 turnout thus far, with about 1,600 or so more voters, whereas young Democrats have declined by a whopping 37,000. Bringing both groups to similar early voting levels, turnout amongst unaffiliated young voters has also decreased by about 10,000 votes. Jim Sterling, who's a research fellow at the John Locke Foundation, said, quote, "Youth voters are one of the least likely to vote groups in America," saying it takes a lot of energy and to get out the vote efforts to get those younger voters out to the polls. The fact that registered Democrats and unaffiliateds are down amongst this group makes it more difficult for Democrat candidates, since college-aged voters are more likely to vote Democrat. We'll get some more details on this with Brianna Kramer from the Carolina Journal coming up in just a little bit here this morning. A federal lawsuit challenging the registration of some 225,000 voters in North Carolina does remain in federal court this morning after the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled unanimously that the case should not return to state court. The suit, which was supported by the Republican National Committee and the North Carolina Republican Party, alleges that the state's election board failed to comply with the federal Help America Vote Act by not requiring certain identifying information from residents, potentially allowing non-citizens to vote. Chief District Judge Richard Myers, who previously dismissed part of the suit, must now decide if these GOP groups can prove a violation of the state's constitution based on federal law. The Democrat National Committee and state officials favoring federal jurisdiction, including the State Board of Elections who put it there in the first place, favor that jurisdiction, argue that proving a federal violation is essential to the GOP's case. A Republican attorney and Phil Scratch clarified that the GOP seeks to ensure affected voters provide additional identification at polls, not remove them outright from the voting rolls. Concerns were raised by judges about voting rights and election integrity, particularly regarding the impact of such changes this close to Election Day. And with it being just 6 days away from Election Day, the idea that we will get any ruling that will have any meaningful impact is probably low. However, we will keep an eye on it and keep you up to date right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:23 on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Continuing our discussion this morning with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation. Mitch, we've got another legal update in a case in which the General Assembly passed a law back in the long session in 2023, changing the way in which the makeup of the State Board of Elections currently happens. That law has been challenged, and we've got a legal update this morning on that as well. What are you tracking there?
Yes, this law that was passed in the General Assembly would replace the current 5-member State Board of Elections and all of the local boards of elections. All of those boards have a Democratic majority by virtue of the fact that we have a Democratic governor. That's the way the law works. If we had a Republican governor, there would be Republican majority state and county elections boards. What the General Assembly wanted to do is replace that existing state board of elections and the county boards of elections with boards that had an even number of members from both major political parties. That was the idea behind it. It would be an 8-member board at the state level. And the governor went to court not very long after that bill was passed and then passed over his veto. He took it to court saying, look, this takes away my constitutional power to be able to control appointments to the state board of elections. A 3-judge panel, bipartisan panel, ruled in the governor's favor on that front, saying that this is taking away the governor's powers. So now the case sits at the State Court of Appeals. And the development this week is that Governor Cooper and Attorney General Josh Stein, who wants to be the next governor, both filed briefs in the case saying that the General Assembly got it wrong, that they're trying to steal powers away from the governor. It's interesting that both Cooper and Stein filed briefs in this case because Cooper is the plaintiff in the case. He's the one who sued. But Stein is filing his brief basically echoing Cooper's arguments as one of the defendants in the case. The case is called Cooper v. Berger, so a lead defendant is Phil Berger, the leader of the state Senate, but the state of North Carolina is also listed as a defendant in the case, and the Justice Department, led by the Attorney General, is the one who files briefs on behalf of the state of North Carolina. So you have the odd circumstance here of both a plaintiff in the case and the defendant in the case filing briefs that sound almost exactly the same, saying the General Assembly got it wrong. Luckily for the General Assembly, they are also defendants in the case, and so their briefs make the opposite argument that no, the General Assembly had the right to remake this elections board that they made in the first place. This will be something that will go before the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals will end up making a ruling. And it's almost certain that whatever the Court of Appeals decides, it'll probably get appealed to the state Supreme Court. You might remember that this case and another Cooper v. Berger case, the Republicans wanted to take both of those cases straight to the state Supreme Court, bypass the Court of Appeals. The state Supreme Court wouldn't do that. So we are going to have both of these Cooper v. Berger cases, this one and another case dealing with appointments to other state boards and commissions, go before the Court of Appeals and probably ultimately to the state Supreme Court.
Mitch, when we look at the makeup of the Board of Elections, not only is 8 a larger number than 5, it's an even number, meaning that somebody presumably is going to have to cross party lines to allow anything to happen on that board in all 100 county board of elections, or you'll be dealing with a central gridlock compared to the current 5-member board where, obviously, as you noted, the Democrat Party has always the tie-breaking vote if that's how things roll down.
And the way that you described it also helps describe the fight between the Republicans and Democrats over doing this. Republicans are saying, look, there needs to be cooperation. We should have an even number so that the decisions that come out of the State Board of Elections are bipartisan or nonpartisan, but certainly not partisan Democratic decisions, or the criticism could be made Republican decisions when it's a Republican-led board. The argument from the Democrats is this is just a ploy. What the Republicans really want to do is have gridlock so that if no decisions can be made, you will have the smallest number of early voting sites possible. You won't get to make any other decisions that would change what is already the status quo. And the Democrats are arguing that that works in the favor of Republicans rather than Democrats. So it is certainly a partisan fight on what to do about this, even though it's been described as a way to have things be bipartisan and an equal representation for both sides. Democrats aren't buying it, and that's why Governor Roy Cooper, Attorney General Josh Stein, and basically all the Democratic legislators are against this idea.
Mitch, we've got another story this morning. What am I reading here? Taxpayers are on the dole for about $77,000 in regards to Election Day ballots. So what's the quick detail on that?
It's not decided yet, but that could be the bill for taxpayers because the State Board of Elections tried to keep the Justice for All party off North Carolina's ballot. People who are going to the polls or will be heading to the polls on Election Day, when they vote for president, they will see that one of the candidates is Cornel West, the academic and activist left of center who is the candidate for the Justice for All party. The State Board of Elections tried to keep the Justice for All party off the ballot. So 3 voters who want to vote for that party went to court. they won an injunction forcing the State Board of Elections to put the Justice for All party on the ballot. Now that that case has basically been resolved and those voters won, their lawyers have now filed paperwork saying, we won, pay us, because you're supposed to pay us if we win this lawsuit. The bill would be $77,000 plus. So if we end up having to spend an unexpected $77,000 out of our taxpayer fund, it will be because the State Board of Elections, in a partisan vote for the 3-2 Democratic board, tried to keep the Justice for All party off the ballot. They failed, and we may end up having to pay for it.
Mitch, thanks for breaking all of this down for us this morning. You can read more on all of these stories by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at your Wednesday morning commute with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Thanks.
It's 5:36. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. We are tracking some details this morning on the presidential campaign front. According to ad tracking firm Ad Impact, the Harris-Walz presidential campaign is making some major changes to its remaining ad spend in North Carolina as we sit here less than a week from Election Day, apparently pulling millions of dollars worth of ads from major North Carolina media markets. This comes on the day that Harris is scheduled to be in Raleigh, the capital city, for an event. Former President Trump over in Rocky Mount for a campaign event. With this, the most recent Carolina Journal poll, statewide poll, shows that both candidates are tied at 47%. Trump leads Harris from Charlotte to Western North Carolina by 12 points and leads Harris by 9 points in the coastal areas of North Carolina. They are tied in Central North Carolina at 45%, and Harris is ahead of Trump in the Triangle area, which consists of the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill market, 55 to 40. With that, again, apparently $2+ million being pulled out of North Carolina's media market. Allegedly, that money is being used to shore up states like Virginia, which recent polling has shown to be quite close, and other more up-in-the-air battleground states like Nevada, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We'll continue to track those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. North Carolina taxpayers may face over $77,000 worth of legal fees after the State Board of Elections attempted to block the Justice for All party from the state's ballot. Justice for All's lead presidential candidate in Cornel West successfully gained ballot access after 3 North Carolina voters sued the North Carolina State Board of Elections. The Elections Board, initially divided along party lines, rejected the Justice for All party and Cornel West's bid in July, with the Democrat members citing irregularities in petition signatures. However, U.S. District Judge in Terrence Boyle ruled that the board's decision likely violated the First Amendment, criticizing its reliance on a flawed survey of petition signers. That ruling mandated that the state board certify the Justice for All as a new political party and include its qualified candidates on the 2024 ballot. As the prevailing party in that legal challenge, the plaintiff's legal team, which often represents Republican groups in election cases, has requested that the board cover their legal fees, which rack up to $77,626. And that, of course, will be paid by you and I, taxpayers of North Carolina, if that suit is accepted due to the State Board of Elections losing that case and potentially now having to pay out over $77,000 worth of legal fees. We'll continue to track that. It's 5:40 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. As early voting continues across the state of North Carolina, we continue to track various metrics here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Brianna Kramer joins us this morning to look at younger voters in the 2024 election cycle. Brianna, good morning to you. Thanks for the time. Where are folks 18 to 25 breaking thus far in this very busy early voting cycle?
Yes. Hi, Nick. Good morning. Things are looking very interesting when we look to young voters in North Carolina. The data shows that there's a higher Republican turnout than Democrats for the young adult age group, which is 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds. So as of right now, 211,000 voters in this age group have voted so far in the 2024 election. But turnout overall is actually less than in 2020. But then we look and we break it down by party, and we notice that Republicans are actually up by 1,600 votes from where they were at this point 4 years ago. And then at the same time, we compare Democrats, and they're down 37,000 votes compared to where they were at in 2020. And this is just young adults we're looking at. So we're seeing growth among young Republicans and a decrease among young Democrats.
Brown, as we look at these charts and look at some of this data, which you can view over on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel, This seemingly is kind of following the trend that we're seeing statewide, regardless of age and gender, right? I mean, Republicans still currently edging out Democrats in early voting, and I guess it seems that even those younger individuals who are what we would describe, I guess, as less propensity to vote, those, I guess, are following that similar trend.
Yes. So actually, so far in the election, we've had about 40% of the total voter registration numbers turn out so far. So a big amount of the whole population is turning out ahead of time to vote. But out of the total turnout, Democrats are down at a statewide level by 340,000 compared to Republican turnout, which is up 9,000 on a statewide level. So yes, these data points are reflective on a state level, and then also when we're breaking it down by demographics. So looking at age groups and parties, we're seeing the same trends overall, which is very different than we've seen before. And, it leaves a lot up in the air for election day, what's going to take place. It's hard exactly to predict, but this definitely is a red flag and an indicator for what could come on election night.
As I mentioned, some of these younger individuals, they're busy with life. They're just graduating school. They're trying to figure out what exactly they're going to do with the rest of their lives. Voting, politics, not always on the top of their mind. So, Brianna, my question to you, you talked to a couple of people for your story. What is driving, in this case, specifically young Republicans out to the polls that is not driving young Democrats, at least as of right now?
I mean, it's hard exactly to say right now. It just shows that the Republican base is turning out ahead of time. So it leaves it up in the air as to if this is going to impact election day voting. But it just shows that Republicans are fired up and ready to head to the polls and cast their ballots. And then unaffiliated as well, interesting to note, is down by about 10,000 votes in this younger demographic as well. So that leaves a large chunk of the voter population up in the air as well. But, like I said, we're seeing Republicans across the board growing from those 2020 numbers.
And I find that interesting. One of the big messages, if you've had the opportunity to turn on television over the last couple of months, one of the messages that Democrats are hitting over and over again is abortion, which tends to, of course, play towards younger individuals that are starting out their lives, looking at having families. That tends to be an issue for younger voters. Safe to say, maybe, Brianna, that messaging isn't resonating as much as Democrats would like it to with the massive amount of money that they've spent on it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that could definitely be the case. It definitely has a more emotional appeal. And we know that the Harris campaign has been targeting women, but kind of leaving men in the dust. And so now they're kind of backtracking and realizing, oh, we need more men voters. And so now, of course, you see Tim Walz and many of the other candidates at the state level and national level trying to target this important voter demographic that kind of seems like maybe they forgot about when they were campaigning so hard on the women's rights and the abortion messaging.
Well, I think you compare and contrast that. We've seen that the president, former President Trump, J.D. Vance have been on Theo Vaughn, Joe Rogan, the Barstool podcasts, all of these things that absolutely have a large audience of younger men. That's their primary demographic. Maybe safe to say that is also working in terms of expanding that message and getting those voters activated, not just here in North Carolina, but Brianna, countrywide, it looks like younger voters are turning out more than they maybe have in a couple of election cycles past.
Yeah, I mean, younger voters are engaged and paying attention, and the Trump campaign is definitely targeting younger voters and men. Yeah, like you said, going on these podcasts, Joe Rogan, Trump was just on, and I just heard that J.D. Vance is going to be on Joe Rogan in the next couple of days now. So they are definitely going, all kinds of different directions in targeting these types of voters, whereas the Harris campaign has kind of strayed away from that a little bit until this point.
You can read more on Brianna's story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's 546, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Nick, we have a report now.
WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
5:51 Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Hey, you can now take the Carolina Journal News Hour on the go with you in your favorite podcast app. Just open it up, search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap that subscribe or follow button, and take the program with you on your own time. You can also listen by visiting WBT.com and clicking on the podcast tab. A busy day in North Carolina today. The Vice President and Kamala Harris alongside former President Donald Trump will both be in the state today. No, not at the same location, not a joint rally or event. Trump will speak at the Rocky Mount Event Center around 1 o'clock this afternoon. Harris is scheduled to be in Raleigh this morning. As of right now, though, however, there is not a location available for that. And her running mate in Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is also scheduled to be in Charlotte and Asheville today. That's according to a report out from the Associated Press. Poll after poll in the state of North Carolina shows almost a dead heat between Harris and Trump in the presidential contest, just 6 days away. And keeping our attention on this major presidential race, well, last night it was Joe Biden making a very interesting comment about Trump supporters on a Harris campaign call.
Or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization is seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American.
Referring to Trump and his campaign supporters as garbage. Caroline Leavitt with the Trump campaign saying, quote, President Trump is backed by a variety of individuals, including various groups that Joe Biden has labeled and Joe Biden has continued to label as now, quote, garbage. There's no way to spin it. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris don't just hate President Trump. They despise the tens of millions of Americans who support him. Kamala does not deserve 4 more years, and President Trump will be a president for all Americans. Likely to see much more reaction to this throughout the day. You'll remember back to the 2016 presidential election when Hillary Clinton referred to Trump supporters as those folks that are in a, quote, basket of deplorables. That comment having an impact on the election. We'll see if this one does as well. Early voting does continue this morning, and despite challenges residents in western North Carolina have faced, of course, some 4 weeks after Hurricane Helene, voter turnout in those 13 western North Carolina counties that were hit the hardest are slightly exceeding the rest of the state at this point in terms of early voting turnout. Data shows that 39.97% of registered voters in those 13 counties have cast ballots, compared to 39.92% in the rest of the state. And while those counties do fall behind the rest of the state with in-person early voting by 3%, they making it up in terms of mail voting. They have approximately 5% more mail ballots sent out to those addresses and those individuals in those counties than the rest of the state. All election boards in those affected counties are open and operational, which means if individuals can and want to vote, they can do so and through Saturday. And when early voting began back on October the 17th, election officials in those areas reported that 76 early voting sites would be open. That was only 4 fewer than initially planned, which was pretty remarkable after all the devastation out there. Recent temporary changes to election law and regulations by the North Carolina General Assembly and the North Carolina State Board of Elections have helped thus far. Election day precinct locations, early voting precinct locations are accepting those early vote ballots from anywhere out in western North Carolina. And with those additional changes, the General Assembly has provided $5 million additional dollars to the state board to assist those all local election boards in those affected areas. That assistance included, for example, an emergency generator that was provided to a Hot Springs early voting site in Yancey County back when early voting started. In the 2024 election, over 211,000 voters aged 18 to 24 have cast ballots thus far. And though youth turnout is very much down compared to where it was in 2020. While younger voters typically tend to lean more liberal, more Democrat, turnout amongst that age range is down by 45,000 voters compared to 4 years ago, a factor that reportedly is concerning for some Democrats who often rely on this demographic. Young Republicans have slightly exceeded their 2020 turnout year-to-date or election-to-date thus far with 1,600 more votes, whereas young Democrats have declined by over 37,000 votes, bringing both groups to similar early voting levels in this election cycle. Turnout among unaffiliated youth voters have also decreased by about 10,000 votes. According to Jim Sterling, who is a research fellow over at the John Locke Foundation, he says youth voters are one of the least likely groups in America to vote. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of get-out-the-vote efforts to get these folks out to the polls. The fact that registered Democrats and unaffiliateds are down makes it more difficult for Democrat candidates since college-age voters are more likely to vote Democrat. This is not something that is unique to North Carolina. I'll note seeing similar reports of youth voters 18 to 25, 18 to 30 being down across the country. That's going to do it for a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. Look forward to seeing everybody at tonight's WBT News and Brews event at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts. If not, we are back tomorrow morning at 5 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.